It's hard to underestimate the importance of a city wall in the medieval or early modern period. The walls symbolised the privileges, the wealth and the importance of a town. They marked up those who were free and those who were unfree. They protected commerce and political liberty from the encroachment of external threats. And because all citizens contributed to their construction and their upkeep through taxation or through physical labour, they embodied the common good which underpinned the functioning of a civic community. That they were the focus of considerable pride is evidence in their celebratory representation found in civic seals, insignia, coins and topographical art. In this lecture, I want to focus upon the changing representation of walls and their gateways over the course of the 18th and the 19th century. The kind of antiquarian and topographical material that I draw on has, of course, been widely used by archaeologists who are interested in tracing the fate of medieval fortifications. But I'm more interested in when contemporaries started to become interested in them as specifically historical objects, and why. In the efforts that were made to preserve at least a fragment of such structures and the meanings and values that were projected onto them. I will, of necessity, be anticipating themes to which I'll return in the next lecture on the architecture of olden time, because walls, more than anything else, were, of course, redolent of olden time. So as this is the last lecture of the day, it's also by way of encouragement to come along, or else turn you off completely, and find out about the architecture of olden time more generally. So city walls with their gateways and their posterns defined the town or the city. They were its most instantly recognisable feature, and an account of these fortifications was a staple of urban topographical literature, which often drew upon descriptions from early modern observers, such as John Leland, who were witness to the walls in a period of active fortification. Moreover, for urban historians of the 18th or 19th century, who sought to raise their study above the level of local insularity, the town or city wall represented the relationship between the particular history of the town and that of the nation state. The right to build a wall and to levy the muirage rate to pay for it was granted by the monarch in recognition of a town's commercial or defensive value. And those episodes when the strength of the walls was needed signified the role of a town in events of national importance, such as the Civil War or French invasions. Thus, for towns that were besieged during the civil wars of the 17th century, for example, the city walls exercised an unprecedented degree of agency in the collective history of the urban community and assumed enhanced symbolic importance as the manifestation of these cities' traditions of autonomy and history. But following the Restoration, urban fortifications became increasingly obsolete. In towns such as Gloucester or Coventry, they had been razed to the ground by either Cromwell or the restored monarchy and never rebuilt. More prosaically, in the majority of towns, domestic stability rendered them superfluous and expensive to remain. Only in the north of the country were defences maintained in the 18th century against the dangers of Jacobite incursion. Walls were, of course, kept in a state of repair in Edinburgh, but also in Chester, Carlisle, Berwick and Newcastle, and even in York in 1745. The corporation was moved by the imminence of a Jacobite threat to make good some of the dilapidation of a past century. Indeed, in Newcastle, the fortifications were repaired as late as the Napoleonic Wars in the face of a possible French invasion. But while defensive functionality may have been lost for many cities in the 17th century, in practice, the walls and gateways were often appropriated to other uses and continue to play an important role in the day-to-day life of most cities. Town walls provided support for other buildings, which in time of peace grew up rapidly against the walls both within and without, particularly as with rising populations, increasing infilling was taking place. In certain towns, such as Shrewsbury or Canterbury, parts of the walls were gradually converted into use as spaces of perambulation and recreation. Meanwhile, gatehouses provided valuable accommodation, which could be repurposed long after the walls had been abandoned to decay. In Newcastle and Chester, they were appropriated by the different guilds as meeting rooms. In York, the Lendal Tower was converted to house the water pump, whilst the gatehouses in other towns were used as storerooms, prisons, watchhouses, and charitable housing for impoverished freemen. They are frequently used to house prisoners and debtors, or simply used as storage space. But ancient walls and fortifications were also a problem. Walls required expensive maintenance and repair if they were not to become a danger to the public, and the masonry represented an easily available source of quarried stone that might be put to other use. And walls limited the expansion of a city and constrained the growth of commerce. Gateways, particularly with their barbicans, represented an impediment to the free flow of traffic through the city. And the proliferation of carriages within towns from the early 18th century created serious problems of traffic management, which these narrow gateways exacerbated. The declining power of guilds and the regulatory powers of corporations over the economy of towns meant that the role of walls and gateways as a means of controlling flows of goods and people in and out of towns was increasingly redundant. Moreover, the towns that were growing fastest in the 18th century, such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, these weren't hemmed in by walls or gateways. So increasingly, the structures were seen as an impediment to the progress of improvement and the growth of commerce. Initially, the dismantling of walls and gateways was piecemeal, but after the Peace of Paris of 1763, the pace of urban improvement in British towns began rapidly to gather pace, and the fortifications of the earlier age were quickly dismantled, while purpose-built jails, meeting rooms, and other spaces meant that the gateways and watchtowers were no longer needed. So in Oxford, Eastgate, Northgate, the Boccardo, and Frau Bacon's study were taken down in the 1770s. In Norwich, all the city gateways were taken down between 1790 and 1810. In Hereford, they disappeared between 1783 and 99. In Great Yarmouth, from 1785 to 1830. One could go on. And of course, in Edinburgh, Netherbow was taken down in 1764. Only a few lingered into the 19th century. But even in Chester, where the walls survived longer than elsewhere, the gateways were all replaced in modern constructions in the classical style, even if the walls themselves continued to stand. Many observers, of course, welcomed their disappearance. This was unequivocal proof of improvement. And with the demolition of gateways and walls, there's generally also a campaign to remove other obstructions and the more ramshackle housing that had grown up and around the fortifications. But even as their practical utility ceased, their potential value as structures capable of inspiring the curiosity of onlookers, either through their historical association or simply as amenities for leisure, this began to be realised. By the 19th century, city walls and fortifications had almost everywhere ceased to be an integral part of the urban fabric or daily life, but they were, in contrast, being reimagined as historical curiosities and picturesque features to be preserved or restored. As embodiments of a town's history, they helped endow the town or city with a distinctive character, and more than any other feature of the urban landscape, lent themselves to the romance of association, through which the visitor could transport him or herself imaginatively into the past. The destruction or threatened destruction of gateways or city walls frequently provoked an artistic response. And the images you're seeing in these lectures are testimony of that. The distinction between the visual response and the antiquarian response is in some senses artificial, as so many topographical artists were also antiquaries. But the point is that from the second half of the century, there's a proliferation of images, sketches, watercolours, etchings and engravings that focus particularly on the picturesque qualities of gateways and city walls. This is part of a blossoming of the picturesque movement and the growth of topographical art more generally that we'll come back to again tomorrow. But the gateways and walls provided the ideal subject matter for the picturesque artist. Their age, their state of decay, the proliferation of irregular ornament, the quirky detail, and the accretions of time all appealed to the picturesque sensibility and offered ample opportunity for the study of interplay of light and shade and variety of texture. And above all, they were replete with the associations so important to the picturesque emphasis on imaginative association. They evoked the passage of history and the customs and manners of former times when such fortifications served a practical purpose. But I think the important point is that there's a recognition that something was being lost and that a record of it and its memory needed to be preserved. And so there's a direct relationship between the imminent destruction and the production of a visual image and the publication as prints. The engraving served to preserve the memory of an ancient fabric and to record that lost, and in the process help to realise its historical significance. So in Oxford, the Boccardo, famously the prison for the Protestant martyrs, and Friars Bacon's study at Folly Bridge rapidly became favoured subjects for picturesque composition, depicted by local artists such as John Malcher, but also others such as Michelangelo Rucca. And although, interestingly, the loss of these buildings was little lamented or even recorded in the written accounts of Oxford, which focused overwhelmingly on the colleges rather than the actual city, in terms of the visual representation of Oxford, these buildings featured repeatedly alongside the images of the colleges themselves. When the Corporation of Norwich decided to demolish all the remaining gateways to the city in 1790, a local antiquary, William Stevenson, responded by commissioning the artist John Ninham to complete a set of engravings. Ninham depicted each gateway as part of a streetscape rather than an isolated structure, and he took his images from both within and outside the city walls. And here the gateways are represented as an integral feature of the urban landscape and of everyday life. And this is in marked contrast to earlier images produced in Norwich, for example, by the antiquary Kirkpatrick in the 1720s, when they're simply presented as isolated monuments detached from anything around them. Paul Sandby's wonderful engraving of the old Welsh bridge at Shrewsbury was first published in 1778, but was republished following the demolition of the Welsh bridge by the Corporation in 1791, which was removed under what Shrewsbury's historian Edward Owen called the unhappy prejudice that it was injuring the bridge. And the print was published again and reproduced in subsequent publications devoted to Shrewsbury. But in 1779, when Thomas Phillips published a history of Shrewsbury, the image that he chose to depict of the Welsh bridge did not illustrate this gateway. He noticed that in the text, he noticed the importance and that it was a neat piece of workmanship. But the plate itself showed the bridge from much lower down the river. It's not until the later 18th century, after the demolition of the gateway in 1791, that we start to find this image actually being reproduced so repeatedly. So Owen published his history, when Owen published his history in 1725, he refers the reader to Paul Sandby's print. And indeed, Owen's son, Edward Price, publishes etchings of Shrewsbury in 1821, and he provides a lament for the loss of the gateway and what would have been justly regarded as one of the most picturesque buildings of England. And he provides an updated version of Sandby's original print, what I think is a very interesting sort of accession of additional picturesque detail in the degree of decay and the amount of signs of age and the quality of the ornamentation is subtly brought out. The relation between the visual image and the written description is an interesting one, particularly in the context of antiquarianism. Did artists simply record what their antiquarian patrons directed them to, or did antiquaries become interested in and attracted to certain styles of architecture or building because the topographical artists had selected them first for picturesque or aesthetic reasons? I don't think it's a straightforward answer. In fact, I think it's a process of dialogue between the artists and antiquaries who were, as I've said, very often one and the same. And it's a topic which we'll return to in the next lecture tomorrow. But rather than dwelling further on that, I want to focus more on how antiquaries and archaeologists and urban historians particularly thought about and engaged with the walls and fortifications. So there are three main themes that I want to emphasize for the rest of this lecture. Firstly is the growing appreciation of the materiality of the walls as historical artifacts. And antiquaries by the 19th century were paying much more attention to the appearance and construction of the walls and what could be learned from their physical fabric. At the most basic level, this was simply a matter of observing and recording the difference between Roman and medieval masonry, for example, or the type of stone used in construction. But the important point is that there was a shift towards emphasizing what could be learned from the presence of Roman bricks and mortar or traces of Roman stonework, rather than simply relying on the evidence of textual authorities. Charles Roach Smith, as usual, exemplifies this difference in attitude. In London, he made careful study of the few standing remains of London's fortifications, which were hidden in cellars or integrated into the walls of extant buildings. But his most notable analysis was in Chester, where he showed that it was possible to distinguish between the Roman foundations and subsequent restorations due to the different coloured lichen that grew on the masonry. Roman lichen was red on a more durable gritstone, whereas the later additions had a green lichen. He notably led a tour of ladies and gentlemen around Chester's walls on the occasion of the British Archaeological Association's visit in 1849, which, he recollected, consumed much time and exhausted my audience. I found myself talking to gradually diminished number, so that at length, when we reached Mr. Massey's to lunch, 2 or 3 were all that remained to partake of it. I'm sure you can all sympathise with him, or rather his hapless audience. Enough of Roach Smith. Secondly, the importance of walls as a site of imaginative engagement with the past. And linked to this was the increasing importance that was attached to their association with narratives of national history in which towns and cities played a formative role. This is another aspect of the narratives of urban modernity and liberalism I've already been talking about. And finally is the potential of walls to provoke debate about preservation and their importance in defining what contemporaries in the 19th century started to refer to as a historic town. And it's these last 2 points that I will be dwelling on rather than the first, which I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear, unless there are any lichen fans in the audience. So when early modern antiquaries or urban historians had tackled the topic of the town walls, typically they provided considerable detail on their extent, when they'd been constructed, when repaired, often including lengthy extracts from corporation records which detailed expenditure on the walls over the years. So this reflects the bias in urban historical writing towards the institutional and the administrative history of buildings rather than their material presence, and also the fact that such information was easily to hand, as walls were the subject of regular surveys by the corporation as part of their maintenance and repair. These records are therefore readily available for any aspirant historian to work from. But the appearance of walls was very rarely even alluded to. They were simply there, a part of daily life, defining the extent of civic jurisdiction, but represented purely through a summary of construction and expenditure, damage and repair. But by the later 18th century, the presence of walls and other fortifications had to be explained and contextualized as part of a different way of life, when internal and external threats rendered them essential to domestic safety. It's interesting that their more pragmatic role in keeping people out and enabling the enforcement of restrictive trading practices was never really discussed in these contexts. So they were illustrative of the ancient manner of fortification and the internal instability of a time, and so acquired curiosity value as survivals from an earlier age. And they were spaces that offered a historical experience because they were tangible, they were walkable, they were visible points of contact with the past that reduced the sense of historical distance. So they become something to be described and preserved rather than simply unparticularized, under-conceptualized elements of the urban fabric. And in this process, they're becoming synonymous with this idea of the historic town. In towns where the walls had been destroyed after the Civil War or completely dismantled, this disappearance is almost always a matter of record in the accounts of the 19th century, despite their non-visibility. So the urban historian might verbally summarize the former course of the walls around a city, might include a reproduction of maps or plans from the 17th century to illustrate their former extent. And we see increasing efforts to trace their continued presence in the modern townscape, identifying remnants in people's gardens or how they're incorporated into other structures, or attempts to pursue their outline through the visible signs of a promenade or a row of houses which were constructed on the former space of the wall. So whereas an earlier historian might have observed that the line of the wall had run approximately along the course of a row of houses, in the 19th century, the observer would be instructed that evidence of where the wall had once been could still be seen in the line of houses. This probably sounds like a really minor semantic change, and I agree it is, but I think it's important, well, I would say that, but I do, because it's a shift from simply stating the absence of a wall to an active effort to seek out historical traces of where the wall had been. And it's suggestive of a more pronounced interest in identifying the visible relics of the past and a willingness to interpret them as part of what is becoming a historicised landscape. So let's take the example of Norwich, where Francis Bloomfield's 18th century history had mentioned the walls on numerous occasions, when they were begun, when they were refortified, when muirage duties were levied. But in the entire volume, there was no section of the history that actually described them. By the time of the publication of another history in 1814 by Brown, the walls had become highly dilapidated, and on several occasions he noted their partial collapse or demolition, but again, no attempt to describe their appearance or trace their course. By the 1840s, however, the guidebooks are becoming much more informative. The presentation of the walls has undergone a significant change. The opening pages of the 1842 guide describe their flint construction, their dilapidated state, and the numerous encroachments made upon them, and then proceeded to trace the visible outline of their course around the city. Thence, wrote one visitor, Susan Swain Madders, you may trace the ancient frontier line of the old city and the sites of its venerable gateways that were but are not. At Stamford, to take another example, William Harrod's 1785 history had, like Bloomfield, documented the construction of the walls and their original course, but ignored their physical presence in the modern town. But in a brief history and descriptive sketch published in 1847, the visitor was directly guided to the remaining fragments of the castle and also the circular bastion opposite the early 19th century development of Rutland Terrace. This was supposed to be the oldest piece of masonry in the town, but as the author pointed out, was much damaged by injudicious reparation. It was, however, worthy of contemplation to remind us of ages which have passed and changes and events which have occurred since it was built. So what is noticeable is that by the mid-19th century, there's not only increasing emphasis upon identifying where walls and gates had once been as an index of a town's growth, but that illustrations were often being provided of what had been lost. Now, in the 18th century, one often finds illustrations of former buildings, partly because the publishers were reusing old engravings, and it wasn't really deliberate, it was just an economy measure. But the deliberate evocation of former times or vanished buildings wasn't something that was explicitly contemplated. But numbers of local histories and guidebooks started to be published with engravings of woodcuts of buildings that were no more. So in Ninham's engravings of the Norwich gates, which we saw back here, these weren't actually published in the 1790s. They were published, however, in 1861 by the Norfolk and Norwich Archaeological Society, and they're trying to recreate a sense of the former state of a town. A history of Coventry in 1852 similarly was illustrated with a series of engravings of the gates that had long since disappeared, with illustrative extracts from the Leet books describing maintenance and repair. So this is, in a sense, of a piece with the efforts that we saw with Roman and the Saxon town to try and recreate a sense of a former state of the town. But I think the particular interest of these gatehouses and the walls and describing them before destruction is because that they were also operated as a kind of synecdoche for the practices of olden time, which made them particularly resonant. And they were particularly important in terms of the burgeoning swell of domestic tourism, because it allowed the visitor to really engage with the past and the society that had made these fortifications necessary. So what were the lessons of history that the walls were supposed to inspire? Briefly, the narrative of the 19th century was that it was the need for urban fortifications was obviated by the onset of domestic stability. And this was always located in the 15th century with the end of the Wars of the Roses, at which point, it was said, domestic architecture became more comfortable and less castellated, the mansion house replaced the castle, towns no longer needed to shelter behind defensive walls to protect their trade and their liberties. Of course, the actual history of urban fortifications doesn't really fit this narrative. As any reader of Leland knew, Henry VIII had invested considerable sums in the re-edification of many town walls, particularly on the coast. And of course, during the Civil War, the 17th century Civil War, the walls played a crucial role in many of the sieges. Nevertheless, the walls symbolise this dominant narrative of English history, associated with domestic stability, commercial prosperity, and political liberty, which arrived in the late 15th century with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. From the end of the 15th century, historians also dated the disappearance of feudalism, the spread of political liberty, and as we move towards the 18th century, they traced the opening up of trade as the protectionist monopolies of the guilds declined. So the decay of the walls also symbolised these later political and economic developments as much as they represented the earlier periods of domestic discord. And the 19th century predilection for tales of knight-errantry and medieval chivalry perhaps also account for the emphasis that tended to be placed upon the wall's military functions as opposed to any other purposes. And in most places, the comments do tend towards the trite and the platitudinous. But in Newcastle, which had retained its defensive fortifications intact longer than any other major city, such comments had a particular cogency. 19th century Newcastle was rapidly forging an identity for itself as a modern commercial and manufacturing city. If Edinburgh was the Athens of the north, Newcastle was the Corinth, supplying the nation with fuel and with sailors and undertaking the shipbuilding which sustained the expanding commercial empire. And this image could be the more powerfully conveyed by contrasting current commercial prosperity with a former age of feudal lawlessness and savagery, when Newcastle was surrounded with walls and fortifications. Newcastle's historian Aeneas Mackenzie, writing in 1827, celebrated the fact that political union with Scotland, the stability of the Hanoverian succession, and the irresistible prowess of Britain's navy, its wooden walls, had rendered these town walls obsolete. And the magistracy, he's noted, seemed therefore determined to demolish them, so far as they interfere with the health and convenience of the inhabitants, who, in case of a hostile invasion, would, with the spirit of freemen, from a barrier of bayonet around their property, even more impregnable than the stone wall of their forefathers, protect their city. In a similar spirit, the 1838 Guide to Newcastle noted the destruction of much of the mural fortifications and the gates, which were no longer needed. In this last period, the character of a town becomes so totally changed from a mere garrison to a first-rate seat of commerce, so great masses of the fortifications have been removed, which stood in the way of carrying on mercantile pursuits and other improvements in the town. But the author also emphasised that the extant walls, which still stood, were worthy of a visitor's attention, however dilapidated, as they not only conveyed a sense of the former strength and importance of Newcastle as a defensive outpost, but were visible demonstration of the subsequent progress of civilization. So the lessons of history were writ in a highly visible form in the contrast between the fortifications and crooked streets and overhanging houses of the former garrison town, and its contrast with the ordered spaces and classicising grandeur of Dobson and Granger's modern city. A fragment of a wall still survives in Newcastle today, the Black Gate, which we see in this illustration. And it survives not least because the recognition of its historic and evidential value, which we have just seen articulated. This meant that even the most hubristic plans for the modernisation of a city centre couldn't do away with the last tangible fragment of a city's military and defensive past. Newgate was destroyed in 1847 to make way for the railway, but Blackgate and an element of a wall still stand incongruously close to the railway arches of a modern city, but now complete with visitor interpretation boards to help the visitor imagine themselves back in Newcastle when it was a Norman settlement. In this sense, Newcastle was typical of most towns and cities where only a small fragment of a wall was permitted to survive, and in most cases, of course, now a carefully cherished part of the urban heritage. But in Chester and in York, the walls were better preserved than almost anywhere else. Both cities laid claim to unique status as walled cities, and the circuit of the walls became a defining visitor experience. There were, of course, other towns where the walls were also in a fair state of preservation, Conway or Berwick, for example. But importantly, these were not centres that attracted visitors in significant numbers, and so there was not the stimulus to historicise and promote the walls as a kind of historical experience. So in Chester, the crucial factor in their survival throughout the 18th century, when walls in so many other places were being destroyed for pragmatic purposes, was that they had already been converted into a leisure amenity, as early as the 17th century, being noted with approval by travellers such as Celia Fiennes. And unusually, they were regularly maintained and kept under repair through the 18th century for precisely this purpose, not because of fear of invasion. The naturalist and antiquary Thomas Pennant included a description of the walls in his tour in Wales in 1773, and he highlighted their importance as the principal walk of the inhabitants, and noted that their upkeep was paid for by the proceeds from muirage duties, which a corporation was still levying long after the walls had ceased to serve any defensive purpose. The circuit was flagged, and about 2 yards wide, making it suitable for wet weather and also sufficiently broad so that pedestrians did not have to go single file. A beautiful promenade for 2 persons abreast, as one guide put it. The Parapet Wall protected the public from a precipitous fall, but also allowed for extensive views across the city and the surrounding countryside. Pennant's account provided materials for later guides and histories throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. But increasingly, the emphasis was less upon the wall's value as an amenity for local inhabitants, but as an attraction for visitors and the opportunity they offered for a uniquely tangible and personal engagement with the past. This is very important for this romantic sentiment of the first part of the 19th century. So just as you could walk the streets of Pompeii and imagine a shopkeeper might walk out to greet you and welcome you into his shop, walking along the city walls in Chester, one might imagine encountering a Roman centurion or standing guard against the native tribes, or with rather more romantic pathos, one could imagine oneself with Charles I, looking out across the countryside upon the defeat of the royalists at Roton Moor. And royalist sentiment, being wrong but romantic, was particularly strong. No one ever engaged in romantic reveries concerning Oliver Cromwell or the Puritans. Chester was rapidly becoming a popular destination for visitors seeking a vision of old world charm. They found themselves transported back in time, surrounded by walls and towers, hoary with age and broken battlements enwreathed with ivy. Louisa Costello, writing for Bentley's Miscellany, was charmed by what she called the embattled memorials of the olden times and their illustration of the genial change in national manners that their happy use as a public walk dedicated to health, pleasure and recreation now illustrated. Thus, the city walls, the only example to have survived intact in England at least, became a valuable asset in branding the city as a tourist destination. And Thomas Hughes, in his guidebook of 1857, from which this image is taken, was airily dismissive of other inferior competitors. The walls of Shrewsbury, York, and other places that occur to us, they're interesting enough in their way, yet hide their diminished heads beside the proud old ramparts of Chester. Yet for all that the walls of Chester remained intact, the actual gateways had not been preserved. Indeed, all of them had been modernised. In York, by contrast, parts of the walls had been lost, but the major gateways had survived, a survival that was much celebrated in the 19th century. Their continued existence, however, and that of the walls, could never be a foregone conclusion, and their escape from demolition and their reinvention as assets rather than impediments deserves further consideration. In the 18th century, the walls had been a highly visible aspect of York's appearance, depicted clearly in the Bucks prospect views and in the ground plan and illustrations of Francis Drake's massive history, from which this sketch by Francis Place is taken. However, they're a very shadowy presence in his text, featuring only incidentally as they were repaired or fortified. Drake quoted Camden's description from Britannia of York as a city enclosed by stately walls, but somewhat surprisingly never traced their course or enumerated their gates. And insofar as they did feature as subjects in his history, they did so by their supposed connection to the Roman city, as Drake, whose patron was the Palladian enthusiast, the Earl of Burlington, harboured the belief that the rounded arch of Micklegate Bar betrayed the remains of an original Roman structure. In actual fact, it's behind the Barbican there, but anyway. So Micklegate Bar was supposed to be a Roman gateway in the 18th century. And Drake's antiquarian sympathies were directed much more towards the Roman city and its ecclesiastical antiquities. Attention was first drawn to the walls in the early 19th century when their continued survival became contentious. There's a particularly notable article in the Gentleman's Magazine of 1801 addressed to the gentlemen who have undertaken the orphan cause of the poor destitute gates and walls of York against the barbarous persecution of their legal guardians. In a thinly veiled allegory, the author Tychophylax described how, when taking an evening walk, he came across a mysterious man taking a piece out of a section of the walls. Quote, after a short jerk with his head, he left his position and passed hastily by me with a smiling countenance and crunching something in his mouth which sounded like nuts. I went up to the place which he had left and found a cavity in the stone resembling the schoolboy's bite of an apple. The author, a day later, sheltering from the rain outside the sign of a hole in the wall, where he heard a strange crunching sound again. He followed the noise into a room where he found a company of men, whom he identified as members of a corporation, crunching away on what he initially assumed to be a venison pasty. Closer inspection revealed it to be a corner of a wall. On further inquiry, he discovered that the quantities of limestone ingested when meeting with more acidity than usual in the bowels had led in some cases to a potentially dangerous degree of fermentation amongst the aldermen, but nothing that a good dose of cordial balm of Gilead can sort out. Thus, Titaphylax alluded to the corporation's grasping willingness to destroy the walls for the members' financial profit. But it was left to John Carter, the outspoken draftsman of the Society of Antiquaries, to draw the attention of the antiquarian-minded public to the fate of York's walls, again in the pages of a gentleman's magazine. According to Carter, the walls of York were crumbling into obsolescence, not through the passage of time, but through the wanton despoliation of the citizens who sought actively to undermine them so that they might be declared beyond repair and rendered a quarry of masonry for building the charmless structures of modern urban life. Between 1807 and 1809, he lambasted the corporation for its failure to maintain the walls, allowing them to fall into decay that they might be completely demolished and used instead for other purposes. He was incensed by the loss of what he saw as not only York's unique heritage, but a part of the national past that was replete with historic lore and demanded to be preserved. In the early 19th century, the walls and the various surviving bars, the gateways, only narrowly escaped demolition on several occasions. In 1800, the corporation had petitioned Parliament to take them down as a wider project, part of a wider project to improve the approaches of the city from the Foss and the Ouse. And this is obviously what had given rise to the 1801 article I've just been describing. And as late as 1849, the walls around Walmgate only just survived. Bootham Bar, Monkgate and Micklegate survived, but not without losing their barbicans and undergoing other modification. And the walls themselves were in a much worse state of repair than those of Chester. The depredations of the Civil War had never been fully repaired. And in the 18th century, they had been unofficially used as sources of masonry. Pigsties and cattle sheds had been built up against them, damaging the fabric, and much of the less salubrious housing in the city was contiguous with the walls. And they represented a problem to the corporation that was charged with their upkeep and which actually had very limited financial resources. They were expensive to maintain. They were an impediment to traffic. And they were a barrier to schemes of urban improvement that involved street widening. And the corporation had a duty to encourage trade and custom, to facilitate the construction of the kinds of genteel residences that would attract wealthy individuals to the cities. Money spent on the upkeep of the walls could, it was argued, be better put to other projects of public improvement. And looking forward into the mid-19th century, there was additional pressure for at least partial demolition from both the railway companies and from health reformers, notably led by Rowntree, who saw the walls as the principal barrier to the improvement of housing and public health. So in the early 19th century, there was a growing body of opinion which was led by the archdeacon and the members of the cathedral chapter and the surrounding gentry who agitated for their preservation, whilst the shopkeepers and the local inhabitants remained much more sceptical as to their continued value and relevance for a modern city, and they were wary of the costs that would be involved in repair and maintenance. So the fate of the walls and the bars became tightly embroiled in local political divisions. But they also became the focus of a long-running campaign which raised well over £3,000 for their repair and restoration. And during these campaigns, The campaigners drew increasingly upon the language of public property and national interest to mobilise opinion. And I'll talk more about this again tomorrow in my final lecture. But for the time being, I want to focus upon how the survival of the walls and the gateways helped to redefine York from its 18th century image of a very polite, genteel city with ancient Roman origins and a Gothic cathedral, to a medieval city of picturesque charm that illustrated the history of bygone times in contrast to its sprawling manufacturing neighbours such as Leeds and Halifax. Given what I've already said about the way in which artists anticipated antiquaries, it should be no surprise that the images of walls and their gateways were available before any of the local antiquaries included such descriptions in their guides or histories. So Henry Kay, for example, from whom these images have been taken, he published his Antiquities of York in 1813, along with a distinctly uninformative letterpress. The early 19th century guidebooks simply note that the walls are becoming impassable due to decay. No case is made to preserve them. In 1818, William Hargrove's history, aimed at the stranger and the visitor, expressed his regret that the walls had been allowed to fall into such a sorry state of repair, and he feared that they would one day disappear altogether. But he enthusiastically endorsed their attractions as a promenade and highlighted their views over the country. And he devoted considerably more attention to the gateways and the posterns than had been in any of the earlier publications. For all that they had been damaged and suffered the removal of the barbicans, they remained a unique and striking example of early modern fortification and York's former importance. The medieval fabric, the Gothic turrets, the portcullis, the coats of arms, these are all analysed in their component parts and described in a level of detail never offered before. John Leland was plundered to recall their appearance in their newly completed 16th century glory, and careful attention was given to their current state and the depredations from clumsy alteration or botched repair. Hargrove in 1818 was beginning the process of the transformation of the gates and the posterns into historical artefacts, or, as one might say now, lieux de mémoire, an essential step if their preservation was to be secured once their functionality was lost. Another brief guide to York, published in 1823, hinted that repair of the walls as well as the gates was something that might be undertaken. And by 1830, John and George Todd's new description of York was drawing attention to the walls' picturesque qualities of decay and also pressing for their preservation as relics of olden time. John Britton provided descriptions of the ancient Bulwarks and a series of engravings in his Picturesque Antiquities of English Cities, published 1830, and a more solidly, or perhaps stolidly, antiquarian treatise on York's walls and fortifications by Henry Lockwood and Adolphus Cates lamented the losses sustained in the 19th century, but also celebrated the success of a talented and spirited gentleman who'd resisted their wanton destruction. So this increasing interest and attention to the walls and the gates in guidebooks and topographical art, such as that which we see here, is indicative of a wider recognition of the wall's potential value to modern York as a unique attraction to visitors, which was gaining ground by the 1830s. So although the corporation couldn't contribute much, the sums raised by the public, as I said, over £7,000, were devoted to the restoration and their maintenance. And the actual activities of those who were campaigning to preserve the walls and their strategies in fundraising started to be detailed as well in the guidebooks. So visitors were told of the generosity of private donors, the sums raised by county balls and other fundraising events. And the walls were increasingly represented not just as unique to York, but, as Carter had pointed out earlier, a part of a national heritage. In a few years' time, pronounced Lockwood and Kate, no circumstance will more testify the taste and munificence of the age than the preservation of the ancient gates and fortifications of the city of York. So, meanwhile, they're casting a wary eye towards Chester, where the walls were better preserved. And the comparative state of preservation actually starts to become a matter of local pride. A failure to maintain the walls could be represented as a culpable indictment of policy, because in terms of attracting visitors and their associated trade, the walls were clearly very important. It wasn't simply a matter of historical sensibilities. Moreover, the fabric of the past was being more widely reimagined as something in need of active preservation, recognition of which was a hallmark of a civilized society. So the efforts towards preserving the walls that we've begun to see described in the guidebooks is actually being celebrated in the same way as were other cultural and philanthropic institutions and associations. So the meanings of the walls are changing. They're no longer simply a symbol of former privileges of urban autonomy or the relics of a warlike society, but in their preserved state, they represented the taste and the judgment of its modern citizens. The collective historic sensibilities of a town were becoming a part of its identity and reputation as much as its culture and philanthropy. York's comparative decline from its medieval heyday, which had itself ensured that the walls were never completely demolished, was transformed into a valuable asset which set it apart from centres of more rapid growth. There is nothing which strikes a stranger on entering York so forcibly as its embattled walls and unique and venerable bars. Those accustomed to the metropolis or the open and straggling streets of our populous towns are not prepared to see a city girt round with a fortified wall and entered by stately bars. Despite the success of the campaigns to restore sections of the walls through the 1830s, the fate of the other sections remained uncertain, and the Board of Health in the 1850s would willingly have seen their demolition. This didn't happen, though. What had changed by mid-century was that those in favour of their restoration and preservation no longer represented simply the clergy, the gentry and the antiquaries, but included far more representatives from York's trading and commercial middle class. The citizens of York, it seems, had been persuaded by the argument that the walls were actually important to the modern town, that not only did they offer a unique opportunity for communion with the past or a picturesque object of contemplation, but were a crucial element of a city's distinctive character. Without the walls and the gateways, the city's reputation and its trade would be diminished, and in the words of John Britton, would sink into mere vulgarity, an ill-built town on a site possessed of no natural beauty. The walled city, then, was characteristically a historic city, but there was also an expectation of the kind of city to be found within the walls, a place that would be redolent of the 16th century with gabled roofs, projecting stories, latticed windows and carved ornamental timberwork. The kind of architecture that 18th century commentators had castigated as dark, backward, barbaric and in need of improvement. In the 19th century, it was all redefined as a positive attraction, and it is this discovery of a vernacular architecture of olden time that I want to focus upon in the next lecture tomorrow.